Hello, welcome to the sequel of What If Luffy Was Raised by WhiteBeard, called What If Luffy Was Son of WhiteBeard. Please like and subscribe, 12 likes for next part. Enjoy. You sure this is the place, kid? A man from the 3rd division asked Luffy, whose grin was starting to stretch across his face. This is the place. He said quietly, but the excitement was there in his voice. Would you like us to wait here for you? Another asked him, and Luffy shook his head no. I will do this all on my own, tell Pops I'll see him later and tell Ma not to worry too much. Luffy said, and the group laughed. Oh, going to be a good boy for your ma? One of them asked teasingly, only for Luffy to laugh loudly. Of course not, I'm going to get into as much trouble as possible. He declared, and everyone smiled. After all, this was their little brother, for better or for worse. We'll make sure to let him know, they said before pulling away from the shoreline, leaving Luffy alone on the island. Luffy looked ahead of him at the path that led him to where his first mate was going to be, and he almost wanted to run ahead to meet him. I'm here, Zoro, he said, but only bird chirping and silence followed him. Luffy walked up the pathway that he remembered led to the dojo at the top, where Zoro should be all packed and ready to go. When he got up there, he heard a bunch of new students practicing outside, and they just ignored him as he walked in. Can I help you? A man with glasses said, causing Luffy to turn around. Ah. Mister. I'm looking for Zoro. Luffy shouted in excitement, and the man really took a look at Luffy before recognition hit him. Luffy? Oh dear, what are you doing here? He asked, Luffy, worry in his voice. Zoro and I were supposed to set out together. He promised me that he'd be here when I arrived. Luffy said, ready to go and look for Zoro, but the man stopped him. I'm sorry, Zoro said he was supposed to meet you last year. The man said to Luffy, who felt his mouth open in shock. You don't mean? Luffy started, and the man nodded. He got tired of waiting and said he'd go find you himself. Luffy felt like face-palming. That idiot. Great, do you know which way he went? Luffy asked him, now in a hurry. With his directional skills, it could have been any way, he admitted, and Luffy sighed. Looks like I have my first mate to find, thanks mister. Luffy said, running back down the trail towards his rowboat, where he had a barrel filled with apples in it to keep him satisfied for a while. Be safe, child. The man called as Luffy waved goodbye, but a weird feeling was in his gut. Luffy was now freaking out inside, wondering where in him saying he'll be back in 2 years did Zoro hear him say he'd be back in 1. Sighing, Luffy didn't see the giant whirlpool that was now in front of him, making it too late for him to turn around. Ah man, Ma's going to kill me if I die here. What can I do? If I don't think of something soon I will die. Luffy said, but was leaning back on the barrel, relaxing. Ah. Even if I do think of something, I'm in the middle of the ocean and I can't swim. He said in thought, but smiled anyways. Man, I'm too hungry for this. He whined, then it was like a light went on in his rubbery brain. Luffy turned his upper half around in a twist and looked at the barrel that held his fruits. Desperate times come to desperate measures. He repeated something Ace had said as he untwisted himself and opened the lid of the barrel and began to eat all the apples he could grab before stuffing himself into the barrel and re-closing the lid. All that food made me sleepy, Luffy said, nodding off and closing his eyes, not hearing the boat he was on crumble around him as the barrel floated off to sea. When Luffy started to wake up, he was hearing voice argue outside of his barrel. He figured that someone had pulled him up from the sea, so he tried to escape it and see who his rescuers were. Unfortunately, the lid on the barrel had been stuck on tight, so he was having difficulties getting it off. Pushing as hard as he could, he finally felt it come free, and in his excitement, he burst from the lid. That was a great nap. He shouted out, stretching his sore arms from being smothered in that barrel. Looking around, he saw people on the ground now and a small kid just staring at him. Who are they? Oi, what's wrong with your friends? If they sleep like that, Ma said they'll get sick and die. Luffy said, simply stepping out of the barrel now and brushed his shorts off. Who are you? The kid asked Luffy, who grinned. My name's Monkey D. Luffy, and I'm going to be the king of the pirates. He said, and the kid's mouth just dropped. Nah, do you have any food? I ate all that I had, so I'm now hungry again. Luffy said, looking around and sniffing the air for the slightest scent of a good meal. Don't you realize what you've just done? The kid asked, and Luffy looked at him confused as the two guys got back up and drew their swords. How dare you knock us down, brat? One said, swinging his sword, but Luffy dodged it carefully and pushed the guy backwards, breaking his sword in the process. At lost, I'm talking with this guy. He said coldly to the men, giving them a glare Thatch had taught him. Wow, what's their problem? Luffy asked, crossing his arms. He didn't think he looked that scary. What just happened? Kobe asked, falling to his knees, unsure of how to make out this stranger. The kid, suddenly fearing for the boy's life, stood back up and begged Luffy to leave because they'd be back with reinforcements, but Luffy wasn't too sure if he really cared or not. Man, I'm really hungry. Luffy said with a smile, looking away from the kid. How can you just say that? There are a lot of pirates on deck. Wait, you can't go that way. The kid said as Luffy began to walk towards where the food smell was coming from. He was completely ignoring the kid that latched himself onto Luffy trying to stop him from moving, but when Luffy wanted food nothing stood in his way. "Ah, I found it," Luffy said in excitement, jumping into the piles of food and eating everything his rubbery hands could reach and stuffing it in his open mouth happily. "My name is Kobe and you're Luffy, right?" he asked Luffy, who kept eating his fruit but he was listening to the kid. "How'd you do that back there?" "It was amazing," Kobe asked and Luffy just shrugged. "Training," he said simply before stuffing more apples down his throat. Abo sighed watching the boy eat more. Luffy wasn't going to stop eating his food anytime soon. "Is this a pirate ship or something?" Luffy asked curiously to the boy who sat down behind Luffy. "No, this ship is being attacked right now by Lady Alvida," Kobe said and Luffy tried to see if he recognized the name and found he didn't. She must be too weak for Harida's database if he didn't know of her. "Well, doesn't matter. I'm strong so I've got nothing to worry about," he said smiling before opening up another crate of food. "Hey, are there any boats on this ship? I'm looking for my friend and my boat got sucked into the whirlpool out there," Luffy said while still munching. Man, he hadn't eaten like this since his ship sank. "Wait, what? You should be dead," Kobe screeched thinking of the bad whirlpool out on the sea. "This entire day's been nothing but surprises for me, so the whirlpool wasn't that much of a surprise," he admitted looking at Kobe now with a large grin. "Hey, are you a pirate too?" Luffy asked him, but he had already looked him over and knew he wouldn't survive as a pirate with being as weak as he looked. The boy looked sad all of a sudden as he explained his story to Luffy, who just shook his head at the kid. "You know, you're a real idiot, the biggest I've ever seen," Luffy told him, not holding his thoughts back as per usual. "Geez, how could you say something like that?" Kobe asked, his voice shaking slightly at being told he was an idiot. "Why don't you just, run away? It shouldn't be that hard," Luffy asked him and Kobe began to panic with a course of no and nevers. That's when it dawned on Luffy and he saw Ace in his mind for a moment and how Ace hated weak people. "So you're a coward and an idiot. I hate people like you," Luffy said with a smile to the boy who just stared at him in shock. Taking a few deep breaths, Kobe looked at Luffy carefully, taking into account that Luffy didn't look much older than himself. "Luffy, what was it that caused you to set sail?" Kobe asked him and Luffy smiled fondly at the dream. "I already told you, idiot, I'm going to be the king of the pirates," he said in his normal fashion of faith. "But many pirates are aiming for the One Piece, and if you want to be the king that means you're aiming for it as well." "Wait, this means you're a pirate?" Kobe rambled out and Luffy laughed. "Yup, this kid was an idiot." "Yeah, I'm a pirate." Kobe's face paled, now looking at Luffy differently. "Your crew?" Kobe asked in fear. "Well, my first mate didn't listen to a damn word I said, so now I need to find him. Then I go get the rest," he said, annoyed once more at Zoro for forgetting. "Your dream is extremely impossible. Hundreds, no thousands of other pirates will be looking for that treasure. You don't stand a chance. It's impossible." Luffy's eyes darkened a little as he punched the kid on his head. "Why did you hit me?" Kobe asked from the floor now and Luffy just shrugged his shoulders, not liking how he called his dream impossible. "I'm not doing this because someone told me to, I'm doing it because I want to. I decided a long time ago that I'd be the king and I have a lot of people who believe in me, so I can't let them down. For them and for me I will be the king of the pirates, and if I die fighting for my dream, then I die, that's it," Luffy said to Kobe, who was now looking up at Luffy with wide eyes, and in those eyes a spark of courage was starting to form. "Alright, now that I've eaten a bit I'm getting out of here. I can't waste too much time, that guy could be anywhere right now," Luffy said walking past Kobe towards the door. "Luffy, do you think that I could become a marine?" Kobe asked Luffy, who just raised a brow. "You want to be a marine?" he asked him and Kobe jumped up and shouted his dream out to Luffy, who laughed. "Who knows?" Luffy asked but was thinking of his gramps and how he might be able to beat the kid into shape. Kobe continued to yell his dreams out to Luffy, who had always believed in listening to others' dreams because they were all important. Kobe had just about finished when the ceiling caved in and a fat hippo of a woman fell through. "Who is it you plan to go after, Kobe? And you actually think this brat here is going to help you?" the lady yelled and Luffy was extremely confused now. Luffy was watching the kid cower in fear. The spark was fading fast as swords were shoved through the door towards Luffy's head. Luffy closed his eyes and dodged each of them easily, his hockey sharper than ever. "My guess here is that you're not Zoro the pirate hunter," she said and Luffy's eyes widened. "Hold up, you old hag, you know Zoro. Where is he? I've been looking for him," Luffy said, jumping down towards Kobe to get some answers from the lady. Kobe's mouth had dropped along with the lady's. "Kobe, who's this fat lady?" Luffy asked. Since she wasn't giving any answers to him, everyone's mouths dropped further. In anger, the lady picked up her mace and swung it down hard towards Luffy's head. Luffy sighed as he jumped away from it, his hand landing on her shoulder and him flipping back onto his feet before looking back at her. "Boy kid, let's go," Luffy said, grabbing the boy and pulling him out of the wrecked ship. The pirates on board were either too scared to fight Luffy or attempted only for Luffy to dodge them easily and knock them down with a small kick. This was way too easy for Luffy and a reminder on just how boring the East Blue was for him. Luffy was now showing off for Kobe since he really didn't have anything else to do when a man climbed up and jumped from behind with his sword. Luffy stepped out of the way and grabbed the man by his head. "It's cowardly to attack from behind someone's back," he said before throwing said man overboard. It seemed that the pirates figured that if they all ganged up on Luffy, they'd have a better chance at beating him, and Luffy made a break for it. "Damn it, if only my haki was stronger I could have knocked them all out." Luffy freaked, and while his observation and armament haki were great, he had little control over his third one. Heck, it didn't just happen easily, and he wasn't actually that pissed off enough to use it. Luffy grabbed onto the mast with his one arm and kept running, knowing full well how freaked out people could be of his ability. Haruta had told Luffy to use that moment of surprise to his advantage, and so that he shall. Running as far as the ship would allow him, he looked back, gave a smirk and rocketed himself back into the pirates, leaving many shocked in fear. Alvida walked up to Luffy, her mace in hand, glaring down at him as Kobe ran behind his back to hide. "So you've eaten a devil fruit," she said, and Luffy just smirked. "Yup," was all he said. "I heard they existed but had never seen any proof of them until today," she said, and Luffy tilted his head in confusion. "Have you been living under a rock, lady? I know plenty of people with abilities," he said, realizing that maybe Kobe was stupid because he had been around this hag for too long. "You're a little more skilled than just a normal sailor, are you a bounty hunter here to fight me?" she asked, a smirk on her fat face. "Nope, never heard of you until today. I'm a pirate," Luffy said simply, and she raised a brow at him. "Just you?" she scoffed, and Luffy smirked. "Not really, but yeah, kinda, until I find my Dumba's first mate." Luffy was still mad at Zoro and was going to give his swordsman a piece of his mind when he saw him. As Luffy was talking to her, his observation haki was picking up a presence he had known all too well, and a smirk started to cross his face. His navigator was on this ship, how perfect was that? "Since then we're both pirates and we aren't sailing under the same flag that would make us enemies," she said simply, and Luffy felt like laughing, like he'd ever sail under anyone's flag other than his own or Pop's. "Luffy, we got to get out of here. You saw how strong she is, so let's go." Kobe whined behind him, and Luffy actually did laugh this time. "Please, I've seen seeking stronger than this hag," he said, and didn't even bother putting armament haki on his arm as he punched her in the gut, sending her flying across the water. "Seriously, not even a challenge?" Luffy said in boredom, walking towards the now freaking out crew that was shaking at the man who sent their captain flying. Suddenly cannonballs were being fired at them, and Luffy actually began to panic slightly. He didn't have his crew yet and sure as hell did not want his bounty to say he was with these jokes, so he grabbed Kobe and turned towards the freaking out crew. "Get us a damn ship, we're getting out of here," Luffy demanded to them, and they went into action. "You said you want to be a marine, so go on over to them if you want, but I'm a pirate, so I'm getting the heck out of here," he said, hopping the railing and running to the boat that those idiots had prepared for him. "Damn it, Luffy, it doesn't work that way," Kobe said, jumping after Luffy, following him. Once they were in their boat, Luffy let the ropes go and the boat was falling into the water below. Once the boat landed, water splashed everywhere and a girl with orange hair looked up towards the one who had just soaked her. She saw the boy with the straw hat with a large grin on his face and her eyes widened. "Luffy?" she whispered in shock, and Luffy's grin only got bigger. "Told you I'd be back," he said before the wind caught sail and they were gone. "We actually did it. We actually got away," Kobe said in both excitement and shock at what was just done. "Please, I've been fighting stronger pirates than her since forever." Luffy laughed and Kobe turned to look at him. "Why were you fighting pirates? Were you helping the Marines?" Kobe asked him, and Luffy really shook his head no. "Since you're the first I've met on my adventure, I'm going to show you something cool," Luffy said, turning around and lifting his shirt up, revealing his tattoo. "That markets," Kobe said as the color began to drain from his face. "Yeah, I was raised by WhiteBeard," Luffy said, and Kobe took a few steps away from the boy. "You're WhiteBeard pirate?" he squeaked out, and Luffy shook his head no. "I'm my own pirate now, but Pops is my Pops," he said, smiling. "I'll never be ashamed to call them my family for as long as I live," he said, and Kobe nodded slowly. "Does this mean you've been to the Grand Line?" Kobe asked him, catching hold of himself. "Sorta, we didn't spend a lot of time in paradise," Luffy said, and Kobe's mind was ready to just turn off at this point. "Paradise, they call that place the pirate's graveyard," Kobe said to Luffy, who smiled. "For some it probably will be. I need to get a super strong crew then if we're truly going to make it there. Ah, I forgot to ask about Zoro's whereabouts." Luffy freaked as it finally hit him. Zoro, last I heard he's being held at some marine base, Kobe said, and Luffy smiled at the boy. Then take me there, he's a part of my crew after all. Luffy said, happy to finally know where his first mate was. And once he had Zoro he could go back and gather Nami since she now knew he was back. This just might be easier than he thought and a smile formed on his face again. I'm coming, Zoro. Man, could this boat go any slower? Luffy thought to himself while leaning on the boat's edge looking at the water. Kobe was still in slight shock about all that had happened, all the new information he had just learned. Kobe, how do you know about Zoro? Luffy asked the kid whose face paled. Zoro is a demon. He's a monster that is known to hunt down pirates and bring them in for their bounties. Kobe said, thinking of all he had heard about the swordsman. Some said that he even brings in his bounties in pieces, and others said that he can turn his swords black through his hands. Kobe shivered at the thought of the man. That might be some armament hockey, Luffy said, a small smile on his face. Luffy had seen Thatch code his katana in hockey while fighting fruit users that attacked. Even Vista sometimes did it but wasn't very fond of hiding his sword's design because of the black sleek. Why are you interested in Zoro? Kabo asked him cautiously, not sure what Luffy was thinking about. I'm going to make him my nakama again. He sighed at the last word. But why? He'll slice you up. Geez, you're going to go and do something stupid again, aren't you? Kobe yelled at him, wondering if Luffy even listened to a word he had just said. Luffy just laughed and decided to take a nap, knowing soon he'd be back with his first mate and this time he'd make sure they left properly. Once they got to the island, Luffy couldn't help but look around a bit in curiosity since his grandpa was a marine and this was a marine base. I wonder where Zoro is. Luffy said in thought, looking around and found people were either jumping away from him weirdly or making weird faces at him in fear or shock. Luffy thought they were funny, maybe they were doing some sort of comedy act. It seems people are afraid of Zoro, Kobe said in thought. I heard the Marine Captain Morgan runs this base. Kobe said, and once again people began to freak, which caused Luffy to laugh. Weird people in a weird town, yup, this is definitely a marine base. Luffy laughed to himself and continued to walk towards where he had heard Zoro was being held. When they finally got there, Kobe began to cry and start muttering to himself, but Luffy was impatient on getting to his best friend, so he started to climb the wall looking around for him. The moment he saw Zoro he couldn't stop a smile from stretching across his face. He's there. Luffy shouted, dropping down to the ground and running around the base to get a better look at his friend before going in. Getting a better look at Zoro, the smile began to fall on Luffy's face. Zoro looked like shit and smelt like it too from where he was standing. He looked thin and tired, his face overshadowed and sweaty. Seeing his friend like this caused rage to fill Luffy's gut. Let's go untie him and then we'll all escape. Luffy said to Kobe, who panicked at this point. But we can't do that. Do you know what people call him? Do you know what he could do to us? Kobe shouted at Luffy, who just laughed. I'm strong and Zoro would never hurt me, I trust him. Luffy said simply, and Kobe just stared at the boy captain in front of him as Luffy hopped over the wall into the marine field below him. Boy, you're such an eyesore. Go away. Zoro said, not even bothering to look up, and Luffy felt his brow twitch in annoyance but never lost his smile. Kobe began to panic as Luffy just put his hand on his hip and smirked. That's not a nice way to talk to your captain, Zoro. Luffy scoffed, causing said man to look up and see who the hell was bothering him, only for his eyes to widen. Luffy. He said, but his throat was so dry he couldn't say much more. Kobe was still hiding at the wall when the ladder was propped up, causing him to panic but calmed down when he saw a little girl begin to rapidly climb up and drop to the ground like it was nothing. Luffy had noticed she was coming but didn't think too much of it since she was just a child, that was of course, until she ran right past him and straight to Zoro, who looked just as shocked at the action. Zoro, who actually wanted to give Luffy his attention since he had been looking for the man, sighed and looked at the little girl who was unwrapping her package for Zoro. She explained to him that she had made him some rice balls since he hadn't eaten in weeks. Luffy didn't like the fact that Zoro hadn't eaten. I mean, he eats about 15 meals a day, so even missing one was terrible. How did Zoro survive with no meals? Of course, Zoro being the man he was completely told her off for the food. Come on Zoro, she's trying to be nice. Luffy said to his friend, putting his hands on his hips, and Zoro turned his head to Luffy. I said I'm not hungry, so I'm not hungry. And do you know how long I've been looking for you? Zoro scowled to Luffy, who frowned at him. Not my fault, you're an idiot. Luffy countered, only for Zoro to growl at him. You shouldn't treat kids badly, Zoro. A voice called and some weirdo walked into the marine base. Luffy was already pretty tired of the East Blue, he had only been here for a day. You still seem to have a lot of energy left in you. The guy said, and Luffy just stood back to watch the banter back and forth between the two people. When the idiot guy took the rice balls and destroyed them, Luffy did find he needed to restrain himself back from punching the guy. Thatch had always told him meals should never be wasted. Zoro looked at the girl in sympathy. Those rice balls did look good, but he was a man bound by honor, and not even the wonderful scent of food could break that. Luffy crossed his arms when the man ordered the marines to throw the little girl over the wall and watched him use his father against the marine men. People like this guy really bothered Luffy, they were the people he never wanted to be like. Luffy knew the responsibility of having a father with a big name and the power that came with it. If Pops ever heard he was using his name for stupid shit like this, the old man would probably be pretty mad at him. Luffy watched the girl go flying, so he quickly turned on his toes and stretched his arms with her to catch the girl before she hit the floor. Once he felt she was safe, in shock probably but safe, Luffy turned back to see what was going to happen. For some reason the idiot guy just ignored Luffy and taunted Zoro some more before walking away, leaving Zoro alone. So they said you're a bad guy. Luffy said to Zoro, who could finally give Luffy his full attention. I don't care what people say about me. Zoro said to Luffy, smirking, but Luffy didn't smile. And they've left you out here to be publicly humiliated. Are you really the strong Zoro I met 2 years ago? Luffy asked him, and Zoro growled at the boy. It's not what you're thinking, Luffy. Zoro sighed and Luffy finally laughed while walking up towards him. I would have escaped within 3 days, so I'm actually quite surprised you haven't yet. Luffy said, walking towards Zoro even though he smelled pretty bad. I'll survive this, Luffy, I sweared. Zoro said, his eyes shadowed under his bandana, and Luffy just sighed but smiled. Whatever. Honestly, Luffy was a bit surprised about this. He expected more from his first mate, and to find him tied up like this kinda bothered him. When you're done being an idiot we'll talk. Luffy said, turning away from Zoro, but he was stopped. Luffy, that rice ball, can you pick it up for me? Zoro asked him, and Luffy looked down at the mess that had been created and frowned. It's more of a mud ball, but sure I guess. Luffy bent down and gathered the mess, then turned back to Zoro. Doesn't matter, let me eat it. He demanded, and Luffy felt his smile return. This was the Zoro he knew. Alright, but don't choke on it. Luffy said, throwing it into Zoro's mouth, and the man ate it, mud, rocks and all. Thanks for the meal, it was delicious. Zoro said happily to Luffy, who smiled softly. Let me get you untied, where's your swords? Luffy asked Zoro, who shook his head. I swore that I'd last a month, I can't go back on my word, Luffy, you know that. He said, and Luffy felt relieved. Zoro wasn't doing this because he was captured, it was because he promised to. Yeah, but since we're talking about words, you said you'd be at your home island to meet me. Luffy said to Zoro, who shook his head. It's you who was late, Luffy. This statement caused Luffy to sigh. I'm too hungry for this. I'll come back to visit you later, alright? Luffy said, walking away before he turned back to Zoro with a cheeky smile. Don't go anywhere, Zoro. He called, and Zoro felt his brow twitch in annoyance. Asshole. Zoro muttered to himself as Luffy left, but he couldn't stop the smile. Luffy had kept his word. Even if he was late, he had come back to him, and now they could finally leave. Just one more week, he was pretty sure Luffy could last just one more week. Luffy had decided to eat at the restaurant where the little girl's family owned when he heard the true story about what had caused Zoro to end up the way he did. He couldn't help but feel proud of Zoro for standing up for the owners and the little girl, even if it did put him in a bad spot. Luffy was finally enjoying himself when the idiot guy came in demanding stuff from the nice owner lady. He ignored him since really Luffy didn't care about him, so why should he give his attention to idiots? Instead he let his eyes wander over to the orange-haired girl watching the scene quietly. Luffy smiled wider and was ready to stand up and go visit Nami, but he was stopped when he heard that Zoro was going to be executed. He hadn't felt this angry in a while. Zoro was his nakama, Zoro had made a promise, and this man was going to go back on his word. Luffy jumped to his feet and ran at the man, slamming his fist into the guy's face, sending him flying backwards. What the hell, you actually hit me. I'll tell my father and have you executed. He said, and Luffy's eyes darkened. Trust me, my father is a lot stronger than yours will ever be. If all you can do is hide behind your dad's name, then you're pathetic. Luffy said and left the restaurant. Luffy, where are you going? Kobe shouted, and Luffy didn't even look back. I'm going to get my first mate and leave. He said, and as annoyed as he was that he didn't get to talk to Nami once again, he knew Zoro's life came first. Maybe it was his anger, or it might have been the way he was walking, but people stepped out of his way when he walked by. He wasn't just going to let Zoro die, especially by the hands of some idiot who used his father's name in such a cowardly way. Zoro. Luffy said, but even the swordsman could hear something was wrong. I'm setting you free and we're leaving. Luffy said, leaving no room for arguing. Luffy, I can't, you know this, what kind of man would I be if I went back on my word like this? Zoro yelled at Luffy was beginning to try and untie the ropes. We'll talk about that later, first let's get you free. But Zoro argued some more, so Luffy finally did stop and looked up at him. Where are your swords? He asked him, realizing he was tightening the knots rather than loosening them. That guy took them away. Zoro admitted not liking that his swords were out of his sight. Then I'll go get them back for you, but if you want them back from me, you're going to have to completely commit to joining my crew. Luffy said, and Zoro felt annoyed at the kid. I already said I'd join you. He argued, remembering his promise. Yeah, but that was 2 years ago. I want to have your word again. Luffy needed to have complete faith that his nakama would join him. Laughing loudly, Luffy ran off to find the kid who took Zoro's swords but didn't quite know where to start. Seeing that the best place to start might be the roof where all those marine people were working, he stretched his arms out and rocketed himself to the top. Of course, though everyone back home had always complained he could break anything by touching it, broke whatever they were working on with his rocket. Who the hell are you? Some man shouted at Luffy. It seemed his had an axe for an arm, but the one that caught Luffy's attention was the kid he had been looking for. Ah, you. Take me to Zoro's swords. He shouted, grabbing the boy by the collar and dragging him through the marine base. Where are Zoro's katanas? Luffy asked the screaming kid, who promised to tell Luffy if he stopped dragging him, so he did. They're in my room, you just ran past it. The guy said, and Luffy gave him an annoyed look. Why didn't you say so, dummy? Luffy complained as Marines began to swarm him, shouting at him to drop the boy and surrender. Luffy wasn't going to surrender that easily, so instead he held the kid up in front of him like a shield. Shoot if you like, I don't care. Luffy knew he was bulletproof, but this guy had pissed him off so much in such a short time he really didn't care if he got shot or not. Since the Marines couldn't shoot the boy, they let Luffy go and found Zoro's katanas. The kid had fainted and Luffy was now needing to hurry since Marines had gathered around Zoro. Rocketing himself down in front of Zoro, Luffy took the bullets and shot them back at the Marines. It's not nice to attack an unarmed man. Luffy scowled at them and the Marines began to shake in fear. That kid's got a devil fruit power. A few shouted, and Luffy was beginning to think that fruits weren't found around the East Blue. What the hell, Luffy? Zoro shouted, and Luffy turned back to him in confusion. You're late again. Zoro smirked and Luffy scowled at him. First off, I wasn't late the first time. I said I'd be back in 2 years. It was you who left early. He shouted, and Zoro. Excuses, excuses. Zoro muttered, causing Luffy's brow to twitch and a tick on his forehead. Why are they ready to shoot you? Luffy asked Zoro quietly, and Zoro shook his head. I don't know. I don't understand what's going on at all. I don't speak, stupid Luffy. Zoro said, and Luffy chuckled. Really? He asked, and Zoro swore when he got out of those ropes he'd slice the boy up. Just give me my damn swords. He said, and Luffy did, and with the skills Zoro had been working on, he was able to cut the ropes just in time as a bunch of Marines began to charge them, their swords drawn and battle cries being shouted out. Zoro caught all of them and sliced through the cheap swords easily. That's armament hockey. Luffy said easily, a small smile on his face at the sight of the black swords. Did you think I was just sitting on my ass waiting for you, Luffy? Zoro said, with his sword in his mouth and the other two in his hands ready to fight. I knew you'd get stronger being a WhiteBeard pirate, so I had to work hard to be able to stand by your side. Zoro said, and a few who had heard what Zoro said looked over at Luffy in fear. The WhiteBeard pirate here in the East Blue, a few began to walk away from them. There's no way we can take on both Roronoa Zoro and a WhiteBeard pirate. The Marines looked ready to run, and Luffy was getting more and more pissed off by the second. I'm more than my father's name. Luffy said softly, but the shiver went down their spines at his words. Who cares, kill them. The Marine captain shouted at his men, who still refused to step near them. Fine, then I order you to all kill yourselves. Anyone who refuses an order must die. The guy shouted, and Luffy had just about enough. Whipping his leg out, Luffy knocked the Marines back and off their feet before turning to the Marine captain with a dark glare. The commander, taking advantage of those who follow him, doesn't deserve to be in command of dogs. He said coldly. Luffy had seen the commander's work and the love they had for their siblings in the divisions. The idea that this guy was taking advantage of good people Marines or not sickened him. No wonder your son's such an ass. Luffy thought out loud. Luffy began to get to work fighting the weaker Marines, which was finished in no time, while Zoro completely destroyed the captain. Thanks, Zoro. Luffy said, knowing that Zoro had his back without even having to check. No problem, Captain. He said as the captain fell to his knees. If anyone else wants to fight, bring it on. Luffy said to them, and Zoro smirked, putting his swords away as the Marines agreed not to fight anymore. Luffy was about to follow Kobe, who had stood up for himself bravely to get more food before they left, but Zoro stopped him. Luffy? He started, and so Luffy gave him his full attention. I promised to become a pirate with you, I swore that a few years ago. But I need you to understand this, my dream is to be the best, and should you ever stand in my way of that dream, I will have you apologize to me at the end of the sword. He said seriously, his silver eyes staring right into brown ones. Luffy watched him carefully, waiting to see if there was even a shiver in his resolve to be the best, but it wasn't there. Zoro was serious. I'd expect nothing less from you, Zoro. he said, and Zoro smirked, the air of tension fading away. It was as if they were meeting once again back on Zoro's home island when the sun was shining and Luffy was having a great time testing his reflexes out with a new friend. "What are you guys doing?" Kobe asked, and Luffy waved for Zoro to follow him. "So where's our ship?" Zoro asked once things had calmed down a lot. "Right there." Luffy pointed out, and Zoro made a weird face. Before looking back at Luffy. "You've gotta be kidding me," he said, and Luffy smiled. "Well, we'll just have to get a better one soon. Maybe Usopp could help us," he said in thought, and Zoro shook his head. Marines had come in and told Luffy that since he was a pirate him and Zoro had to leave. Luffy considered making a scene to help Kobe, but a different idea came to mind. "Boy, mister," Luffy said simply to the marine guy, who looked at Luffy. "This kid here has potential and I sure as hell don't want him." Luffy began, and Kobe looked at Luffy curiously. "Call my gramps, he's always looking for new people to push around," Luffy said, and the marine felt even more confused. "Who is your grandfather, kid?" he asked him, and Luffy laughed his laugh. "Monkey D. Garp, he'd love to have a new student." A few jaws dropped at the information, and even Kobe looked at Luffy in shock. "Your grandpa is the marine hero," and Luffy nodded with a smile. "Yup, tell him I sent you and he might go a little bit easier on you, but I doubt it." Luffy laughed before pulling Zoro and running to their ship to set sail. Luffy had done what he had wanted and now had his first mate by his side, as it should have been, so now it was time to go find Nami. He just had one more thing to get straight. "Hey Zoro, wherein me saying I'd be back in 2 years, did you get one?" He really needed to know this, and Zoro looked away. "You said you'd be back when you were 17. I could have sworn you told me you were already 16. He said, and Luffy sighed. "I was just turning 15 at the time," he said, and Zoro blinked a few times. "You're now just turning 17? He asked, and Luffy smiled. "Just because I'm young doesn't mean I can't kick your ass," he challenged, and Zoro smirked. "Never thought I'd have such a brat as my captain." He laughed, and Luffy joined in on it. "Let's get stronger, Zoro, together," he said, reaching his hand out, and Zoro grabbed it. "Together we'll become the greatest," he said, and Luffy smiled at him. "Then we'll go beyond that." Luffy felt complete now, and who could ask for any better? To have the greatest swordsman in the world as his right-hand man was like a dream come true. "Nami, you're next." Luffy and Zoro sat in their small boat and had unfortunately been sailing for a long time now with no land in sight. "Are you sure you were a WhiteBeard pirate? Aren't they supposed to have some navigation skills?" Zoro asked Luffy as he was leaning back relaxing but stared at his new captain. "What about you, Mr. Pirate Hunter?" Luffy scoffed, and Zoro glared at him, but unfortunately neither had the energy to fight. "I'm so hungry," Luffy complained, leaning over the ship's edge. They had been sailing in circles for a few days and had run out of food at some point. Luffy had begun to start fishing, but nothing short of a sea king could fill his stomach, and East Blue wasn't cutting it. Luffy had started to pull himself together when a large gust of wind shook the waves and sent his precious straw hat flying. "Ah!" Luffy freaked, reaching his hand out on the sea to catch his hat, tripping over the edge and nearly falling in. Zoro, realizing his captain was about to drown, jumped up and grabbed Luffy by the middle, holding him steady as he grabbed the flying hat. "Thank goodness," Luffy sighed out, taking a deep breath. "What's so important about that hat anyways?" Zoro asked, wiping his brow and looking up at Luffy, who smiled down at the hat in fondness. "This hat is from someone I respect greatly," he said, thinking of Shanks and all he had done for him. "Oh? Is it from one of your former crewmates?" Zoro asked him, interested. "Nah, it's not from one of my siblings or even my ma or pops. This hat is from a man named Shanks. He saved my life once and gave me this hat with the promise that I am to become the Pirate King and bring it back to him." "That sounds like one heck of a promise." Zoro smiled, and Luffy nodded. "It's the promise from an emperor and the future Pirate King," he said seriously, taking his hat and putting it back on his head safely and looking at his first mate. "Zoro, I was just thinking, how did you learn hockey?" He knew hockey wasn't easy to learn, nor control. It was also strange that he was able to learn it here in the East Blue, where there wasn't a real need for it. Zoro sighed, knowing this question would be coming sooner or later. "Back when I was a kid I used to go dojo to dojo challenging people. Once I was beaten, I would sometimes ask if I could stay and be trained there, and most would just kick me back out. One dojo I challenged had a man who wielded a black sword, and it interested me. It wasn't until I met you and saw how you created a weapon with your own hands through the same blackness that I began to search into it more," Zoro said, and Luffy nodded. "So that's why you were interested in hockey, but how'd you learn it?" Luffy asked, and Zoro smiled, touching the hilt of his special sword. "The dojo owner, he isn't as weak as he looks. He once trained hard in the ways of the sword and taught me much about my willpower to become stronger. If I'm going to become the greatest swordsman, it's only natural my swords advance with me in strength," he said, and Luffy nodded. He thought he felt something different by that Mr. I can't hold it for long and I can only cover one of my blades, but not to the point. I'm nowhere near strong enough yet. He said and Luffy patted Zoro's shoulder. That's why you'll become stronger. He encouraged before looking up towards the sky and smiling a mischievous look now in his eyes. Luffy? Zoro asked realizing the boy was up to something. I think I found us some dinner, I'll be right back. He said stretching his arms up and rocketing towards a flying bird in the sky, only to get his head caught in the beak. Crap. Zoro save me. Luffy shouted and Zoro freaked as the bird flew Luffy away. Damn it Luffy. Zoro shouted as he began to row his boat as fast as he could to chase after his idiotic captain. Luffy couldn't say he wasn't having fun now getting this chance to see the ocean from this high up. It reminded him all too well of flying on Marco's back when he was a kid and how he missed getting to fly with his ma. He loved the way the wind felt and how he could see his ocean from every angle when he was in the air. The bird's beak was pretty strong as well, but it seemed to be treating him rather gently for having his neck stretching through its beak. Luffy also knew that should he have needed to he could have gotten out of the bird's beak, but that would mean he'd fall pretty far and this bird promised an adventure. Ah, an island. Luffy said happily looking down at the land below him noticing a scene happening of a few people chasing what appeared to be a girl. Okay you can let go of me now. Luffy asked the bird, but it didn't stop which annoyed him. I said put me down. Reaching his hands up, he grabbed the bird and twisted it so it lost its balance while flying and its beak opened up causing Luffy to fall straight down to the island below. Good thing I'm rubber. He shouted as he fell bouncing a few times before coming to a stop. The girl that Luffy had come to recognize over and over again stared at him with wide eyes in shock. Ah, it's you. Luffy began to say and her eyes darkened before a false smile came to her face. Oh boss I'm glad you came. Take care of them for me alright. She said and Luffy tilted his head in confusion on what she was saying before people started to shout at him and one even swung their sword knocking his hat off. Luffy turned to look at the man anger in his eyes, ignoring anything he was saying before he punched both men down to the ground and picked his hat back up, putting it on his head. Don't touch my hat. Luffy whispered out and turned to look at Nami who was sitting on a roof now a small smile on her face. You're pretty strong. She said to him her eyes watching him like a cat. Yup. He said simply. Why don't we team up, Luffy? She leaned down on her elbow and stared at him closer. No thanks. Luffy wanted her as his navigator, but there was no way he was going to become a petty thief. Wait hold on a minute. She said just before Luffy fell to the ground begging for food. Geez, you haven't changed a bit. She said but helped him up with the promise to feed him. Taking him to a house Nami started to prepare meals for him not realizing how much this guy could eat. So you came back huh? She asked him and he looked up from his food. Yeah. I said I would. He said through mouthfuls then looked around. So do you live here? He asked her and she shook her head. No the townspeople are gone now because Buggy and his crew are here. She said and Luffy laughed. So you really are nothing but a thief. He laughed earning a glare from her. I'm not. I only steal from pirates so don't compare me to scum like them. She said and Luffy raised a brow. Yeah I remember you doing something like that when we first met but isn't a thief a thief? He said to her and she scowled at him once more. I just need 100 million, no matter how long it takes, no matter what I have to do, I'll get it. She said looking away from him. Luffy was interested in why she needed the money but chose not to ask if she wanted to tell him she would. With this chart of the Grand Line I will be able to make my dream a reality. She said and Luffy's smile widened on his face. So you're a good navigator then? He knew she was a good one because she was able to take him places once before but navigating the Grand Line was nothing like the East Blue. Yup, I'm the greatest navigator you'll ever find. She said winking. That's exactly what I was looking for. Nami, join my crew. He said standing up and she smiled happily. Really she said then he opened his mouth once again and made her mad. Yeah on my pirate crew. Her eyes darkened at him and she slammed her fist down on the table. Never. I'll never become the thing I hate the most. Nami said to him and he shrugged. And here I thought I had found a good navigator. He pouted but wasn't going to actually force someone who clearly despised pirates to join him. Nami was looking out the window, but since she clearly didn't want to join him, he was beginning to lose interest in her now. She on the other hand was thinking of a way to trick Buggy into giving up his treasure to her and keep her map at the same time. Do you really want me to be your navigator? I guess I can join your crew. She said to him leaning in closer and he jumped up in excitement thinking he had gotten her all wrong. Really I'll do anything. He really would. Alright then, if you'll do anything at all for me, then I want you to go and meet Buggy and his crew. She said and he nodded. Sure let's go then. He said and Nami inwardly smiled at how trusting this idiot was and that made her able to get him from behind. Why did you tie me up? He asked her confused and she just smiled. It's just for looks, not that big of a deal I promise. She said and he shrugged going along with it. Sure why not, Shanks told me stories about Buggy, so I'm excited to meet him. Luffy had been told that Buggy was an idiot but a good guy, so he was interested to see if that was true. The walk to see Buggy and his crew was silent. Nami was trying to plan out her every move, while Luffy was just excited to meet a pirate who had known Shanks. Nami did feel bad about what she was going to do, but for her dream for her freedom, she would do anything. Also this boy was just another pirate destined to bring more pain and suffering to everyone he meets. Throwing Luffy down in front of Buggy, she asked to join his crew and returned the map of the Grand Line. Of course he welcomed her in with open arms and threw the tied up Luffy in a cage. Luffy hated cages, they made him feel trapped and small, so he did what he does best when he's annoyed, he shouted at the top of his lungs. Buggy scoffed at him and Nami made up excuses for his behavior, waving her hands and accepting her drink graciously. Luffy wanted to party as well, though this party was a bit weird with a clown theme or something. Attempting to reach his arm out to grab something to eat, he started to regret letting Nami tie him up. Now listen up. Buggy called and began to explain his plan on something stupid called the Buggy Ball, which brought out a lot of cheers. I've seen better cannons on rival ships than that thing. Luffy pouted, leaning back on the cage. Since he couldn't go anywhere and couldn't eat anything, he might as well just sit there and wait to be released. Luffy was about to close his eyes when the cannon was set off and a large part of the town was destroyed, spiking his interest. So, that cannon does actually pack a punch, he said, and judging by Nami's reaction, she was in way over her head this time. Buggy began to praise his work along with himself, claiming with his cannon and his devil fruit powers, he would become the next pirate king. Luffy wasn't just going to take that sitting down ever. No you're not, I'm going to be the pirate king. He shouted at Buggy, who then turned his attention towards Luffy, who didn't look away. Also, those who just rely on their devil fruits alone don't last for very long, especially in paradise. He said, remembering what had been taught to him by Thatch. I can see why you've grown tired of him, Nami. Buggy said with a laugh, but the boy's words had caught his interest. By the sound of your words there, I'd almost say you've been to the Grand Line. Buggy said and Luffy nodded. I was born and raised there. A few gasps went around the crew, but Buggy shrugged it off. No matter. He said and turned to Nami, who was trying to turn the attention away from Luffy, but it wasn't working at all. Buggy then offered Nami the chance to blow Luffy away with one of his Buggy Balls as a way to prove her loyalty to Buggy. They got the cannon set up and point towards Luffy, who was giving Nami a blank look. This is what you get when you go into a situation with a half-ass resolve. He said to her and she growled at him. Like you know anything about resolve. Should I lower myself to killing innocent people? Is that the way of a pirate, she said, but he didn't look away. Luffy knew from the very beginning that this was too much for the girl and that in her hate for pirates, she underestimated them. The Buggy pirates were calling to her, telling her to just shoot it already, but Luffy began to grin at her with a wide smile. No, it's about being able to put your own life on the line. He said, his eyes firm and his smile true. Nami just stood there shaking and stunned as someone tried to light the cannon for her. Realizing what was happening, she decided to follow the boy's advice and put her own life on the line just this once. Pulling her wooden rod from under her skirt, she smacked the man over the head, stopping the cannon from being lit. What are you doing, Nami? Luffy asked her, now really confused. I refuse to lower myself to the level of people who took away my most precious person. She said, not looking at him, and he got it. Pirates took away someone she loved, so she resented them for it. A flash of Marco appeared in Luffy's vision. What would Luffy do if something happened to him? During the time he was thinking of his family, the fuse had been lit by a small spark and he began to freak, calling out to Nami to stop it, but she was in over her head as it was. Buggy had ordered his men to attack and Nami turned around quickly, grabbing hold of the fuse, stopping it from burning anymore. Luffy wasn't sure if he was immune to explosions or not, since Marco had never allowed him to get too close whenever any were happening, so he was glad he didn't have to find out right now. Nami's back was open though because she had stopped to save Luffy and pirates were about to attack her from behind until a little green swordsman stepped in to save the day. Zoro. Luffy said in excitement. Seriously, I can't leave you alone for even a second, can I, Captain? Zoro said, turning his eyes to Luffy, who laughed. How'd you find me? With your sense of direction you should be halfway to Pops by now. Luffy joked and Zoro's brow twitched. Are you done joking around? Zoro asked and Luffy nodded. Can you cut the cage? Luffy asked him and Zoro actually nodded. This cage isn't made of steel, so it should be no problem for me. He said, swinging his swords down and cutting the cage perfectly, letting Luffy go free. Some of the pirates began to take a step back while others looked excited to fight. Your orders, Luffy? Zoro asked as Buggy began to walk forwards. Retreat for now, but let's leave them something to remember us by. Luffy said, looking at Zoro, who smiled. Roger that, Captain. He turned the cannon towards the buggy pirates while Luffy lit the fuse, setting the cannon off in their faces. Looks good on them. Luffy laughed while Zoro had thrown Nami over his shoulder, bringing her to safety with him. What the hell? She said once Zoro had put her down, she brought both her fists down on their heads, causing bumps to grow in that place. What the hell yourself witch? I just saved your ass. Zoro yelled at her, but she looked at Luffy. Would you run away? She yelled at him and he looked up at her from the ground still nursing his bump. Because fighting them is annoying and Shanks is a liar. That guy isn't a good guy at all. Luffy pouted planning to give Shanks a piece of his mind for that someday. That's not the problem. I need that chart of the Grand Line. You said you'd do anything for me didn't you? She asked him and Luffy sighed knowing he did say that. Just ignore her Luffy and let's go. Zoro said standing up and looking away from them. No I can't do that. He said and Zoro looked down at his whimsical captain. A promise once made can't be broken. He closed his eyes, then looked back up at Nami who had crossed her arms glaring down at him. I'll get you that chart back. He said and she nodded. As well as all my gold. She questioned and he nodded. Every little bit. And she smirked. She would use this boy to get what she wanted because after all, he was nothing more than a useless scumbag pirate and a pirate that trusted way too much. I'll be counting on you. She smirked her eyes dark and Zoro swore he'd watch Luffy's back around her whether Luffy trusted her or not. Luffy was looking around where they had landed after escaping from the boogie pirates. So what's your plan Luffy? Zoro asked him and Luffy laughed loudly. I'm just going to kick all their asses. He said simply and Zoro nodded. Oof, a dog barked sitting in front of what seemed to be a pet food store. Hey doggy you're kinda cute. Luffy said kneeling down to check out the dog that was sitting as still as a statue. Leave him alone Luffy. Zoro said, but Luffy continued to pester the dog until it bit his face and refused to let go. And you stop playing around Zoro asked him as Luffy began to pull on the dog to get him to let go and once he did he took a few steps back away from the growling little creature. So not cute. Luffy pouted glaring at the dog. Hey, leave him alone. A man yelled coming up to the little group. Luffy was glaring and Zoro was sighing while Nami just watched from a distance, not wanting to get too involved with these pirates. Who are you old man? Luffy asked him and his brow twitched on his face. I'm not an old man you brat, I'm the mayor of this town. Who are you people and why are you bothering Chaochu? The man shouted at Luffy. So this dog's name is Chaochu? Nami asked the mayor coming up beside him to pet the dog who didn't bite her like it did Luffy. Yes that's him. The mayor said and Luffy glared some more at the creature. Such a lazy dog just sitting there doing nothing. Luffy tried to always forgive but it didn't stop him from being a bit bitter. If you guys are just going to sit around and talk I'm heading for a nap. I've been chazzing you all over Luffy so I'm tired, wake me up once you've got a plan in mind. Zoro yawned and walked into a house to sleep. So what's this guy's story? Luffy asked looking at the dog that yawned but didn't move from his spot. He's guarding this store. The mayor said and Luffy raised a brow at him. What's so special about this store? Luffy asked him and. This store was once run by a very close friend of mine and that friend owned this dog. The mayor said and Nami looked at him. The owner died? She asked him sadly and the man nodded. Yeah, a little while ago. He said to Nami while filling up the dog's dish with food. Then why does he still stay here? She asked while Luffy was giving the dog a blank look. Because this place is almost like his treasure I suppose. He said and respect filled Luffy's eyes. This family is my treasure Pop's voice rang through Luffy's mind and he smiled at the dog understanding now. Luffy was getting caught up in his own thoughts he didn't really hear the banging on the ground until Nami and the mayor were screaming and running away. You got a lot of guts dog I'll give you that. Luffy said to him but the dog didn't respond at all. Luffy felt the presence of someone coming up behind him, he tilted his head up from where he was sitting to look at the lion and the freak. I see you've been abandoned and after you went through so much to escape. Now where is Roronoa Zoro hiding kid? The weird man said and Luffy just stared trying to take him in. Your clothes are funny. Luffy said to him and laughed a bit making the man growl on top of his weirdly colored lion. It's not an outfit you rude thing, it's my hair. He shouted and Luffy just stared at him. That's even stranger. You know you should talk to my big brother Thatch, his hair's kind weird too, but he could probably give you better tips on what to do with it. The man wasn't listening to a thing Luffy was saying though and ordered his lion to attack. Luffy sighed and stood up to fight the weakling, only to be smacked to the side by the lion's great paws. Well that was surprising. Luffy said to himself after he had pulled himself out of the rubble. Luffy normally could see an attack before it happened, so he just put it up to the lion got lucky, but it wouldn't happen again. You're alive. Nami yelled at Luffy in shock and Luffy tilted his head in confusion. Is it a bad thing I'm alive? He asked her and she just stared at him. I don't really want to fight those guys. Luffy complained and Nami snapped out of her stupor. But you promised. She started and Luffy looked at her. Yeah, I promised I'd kick Boogie's ass, but those guys mean nothing to that promise. He said and Luffy walked past her. Where's Zoro sleeping this time? We got to get going. Luffy simply said and Nami pointed to a house that was now being blown up. You got to be kidding me. Luffy shouted running towards the house slightly freaking out inside. I just found my first mate and now some stupid clown's going and blowing him up. Luffy was ready to start digging through all of the rubble when Zoro just stood up leaving a slightly shocked Luffy in place. Damn it, I was having a good nap. He complained stretching his arms and looking down at Luffy. What's your problem? He asked his new captain who shook his head and let it go. We're going to beat up the clown, you ready? He asked Zoro who touched his sword's hilt and smirked. Took you long enough. He complained as he tied on his bandana. They said they were looking for you, did you do something to them? Luffy asked him as they began to walk away. Not that I know of. Zoro sighed and a small sound caught Luffy's ears, causing him to turn and look at the dog howling. Wait one moment. He said to Zoro who nodded knowing his captain would do what he wanted either way. Luffy walked towards the dog then passed it right into the burning building of the old pet store. What does he think he's doing? Nami screamed as the place was on fire. Zoro stood still keeping an eye on his captain but didn't move in to help him. Luffy emerged from the flames a small box of food in his hand and he set it down in front of the dog. I'm sorry everything else is gone. He told the dog who looked at the food then barked picking it up with his teeth and walking away. What was that all about? Zoro finally asked Luffy knowing the man could be whimsical. Treasure is important. He said simply then turned away. The mayor hadn't caught up with the group yet so he didn't see the actions taken by Luffy and the anger in the boy's eyes. Let's go kick some asses, Nami are you joining us? He asked her and she stared at him. I will never join a pirate crew. She said simply her eyes dark and glaring at Luffy and he was ready to give up on her completely. But for the sake of my dream and goals, I don't mind working with you. She said and Luffy gave her a high five. Zoro on the other hand was watching her carefully, she didn't say she was joining the crew she said she would team up. She was an alliance to this two-man pirate crew and alliances usually ended in betrayal. Luffy now having Nami on his crew or at least in his mind, walked with them towards the circus going on to find Boogie laughing and drinking away, but not too surprised to see them. So the thieves have returned. He chuckled out and Luffy frowned at him. I'm no thief, I'm a pirate. Luffy said to him and he laughed. Whatever you are doesn't matter. He shouted and a bunch of weirdly dressed people jumped at Luffy who used his Gatling gun to send them all flying backwards. Seriously these guys are super weak. Luffy complained looking at Nami who pointed in the direction of where she was going so he nodded letting her do as she pleased. I sent one of my crew after you Urano Zoro, to think though that the pirate hunter would turn into a pirate. Buggy said and Zoro rolled his eyes. I was just looking for my lost captain. He said and Luffy felt a tick form on his head. Takes one to know one. He muttered under his breath. It doesn't matter. Buggy shouted as a man on a unicycle came forward and challenged Zoro to a fight. Beast Blue is so boring. Luffy complained some more and Buggy looked at him carefully. Your hat is so eerily familiar, it reminds me too much of that damned red-haired man. Buggy said to Luffy who smiled widely. Yeah, it was given to me by Shanks. He said and Buggy's eyes widened at the new information. So you know red-haired Shanks then? He asked Luffy who nodded. Yeah and he told me lots of stories about you. Luffy said causing Buggy's ego to go up. Well of course he did. I am after all the great Captain Buggy. He declared and Luffy laughed. Yeah he said that you were the biggest idiot he had ever met. And the ego trip fell as well as Buggy's smile. Why that'll kill you. He said and began to fight against Luffy who dodged the attack simply. You need to move faster if you want to fight with me. Luffy challenged and Buggy stopped to once again take in this boy in front of him. Your observation skills are amazing, where did you learn to move like that? Buggy wasn't one to compliment another or so Luffy had heard so he took it in respectfully. I learned all I know from the New World and my family. He said and Buggy's eyes widened. So you have been to the Grand Line? He asked and Luffy gave him a face that stated clearly. So if I kill you I can say that I killed a New World pirate. Buggy grinned thinking his reputation would go up higher. I wouldn't try it if I were you. Luffy said and aimed one of his punches at Buggy's chest only for the man to split into pieces to avoid it. And you use armament hockey. He said looking at the blackened fist that slunk back. You're a fruit user. Luffy said to Buggy who smiled. So are you it seems. I ate the Barabara no Mi. He said but Luffy sensed a note of bitterness in his voice. I ate the Gomu Gomu no Mi. He replied and Buggy floated above Luffy's head but his feet remained on the ground. How did a brat like you come by getting a devil fruit? Buggy asked him and Luffy explained how he got his fruit briefly not really going into detail. So Shanks caused your misfortune. He yelled and Luffy became confused, sure he couldn't swim, but was it really that bad? Not really, I ate it on my own, Shanks didn't tell me to. He said, and Buggy glared at Luffy now before explaining his misfortune with the fruit he ate and how Shanks played a part in it. Ah, I see. You're just a bitter old idiot. He said, dropping his fist into his open hand. I've had enough playing with you, time to die. He shouted, pulling out some small daggers to throw at Luffy, and Luffy took his stance to fight back with. Bring it. Luffy growled as Buggy threw his knives at Luffy, and the boy bent and twisted till he could properly dodge each and every one of them. Stay still, brat, and let me kill you properly. Buggy shouted at Luffy, who laughed and turned his eyes towards Zoro, who was fighting a swordsman on a unicycle. Zoro was having no troubles with this man. In fact, with all the training he had done since meeting Luffy, this was one of his weakest opponents. Please tell me there are stronger people on this crew than you? He mocked the man as a lion came around the corner. I have found you, Zoro. The man on top of it shouted, and Zoro sighed. I had to ask, alright, let's see if you're stronger than this idiot. He shouted cockily at the man, causing the original fighter to growl at Zoro. I'll make you pay for that. He shouted, and Zoro grinned, looking down as the bandana darkened his eyes. Then show me what you got. This is a pirate's fight, not a playground. Nami was slinking through the ship, her knowledge of where the treasure was usually stored clear in her mind. She may have teamed up with these pirates, but there was no way in hell she was going to be fighting for them. Her goals came before anything and anyone, and she would do almost anything to ensure they came true. Found you. She said, the gold's glimmer reflecting in her eyes as she smiled brightly and began to gather it all up to head out. You really think you can defeat me? Buggy shouted at Luffy, his hand flying down and grabbing the hat off of Luffy's head, while his other hand was throwing blades at Luffy, keeping his on his toes. Zoro, who was fighting two opponents, felt the air chill once the straw hat was off the boy's head. Give me back my hat. Luffy said calmly, but there was danger leaking from his voice. Oh? Is this straw hat really that important to you? He asked smugly before pulling more knives out and stabbing the hat through, breaking the straw. Return this hat to me in good condition, he heard Shanks say in his memory as Buggy was laughing away, pleased with the reaction he had gotten out of Luffy. Captain, some girl's running off with all our treasure. One of the pirates screamed, and Buggy turned his attention away from Luffy, dropping the now torn hat down on the ground and looking towards a running Nami. That bitch. He yelled and moved to attack her. Nami had her hands filled with bags of gold and couldn't stop the clown from attacking her. Luffy looked up at Buggy, his eyes dark with rage, before walking towards him, grabbing him by the shoulder, redirecting him away from the girl, making him face Luffy. No one touches my hat. He shouted, coating his hand in armament hockey and punching Buggy in the face as hard as he possibly could, causing the man to faint from the pressure. Now lying on the ground, Luffy glared down at the clown pirate before picking his hat up and putting it back on his head, the anger spent. And here I thought you'd be stronger since you were once a Grand Line pirate. Luffy said to the now beaten pirate as he tied him up quickly with ropes he found close to him and threw the pirate away like trash. Walking away from the shocked remainder pirates, he turned to Nami, who was staring at Luffy in shock. Did you get what you needed? He asked Nami, who nodded silently, and Luffy looked at Zoro, who had beaten both the men easily. Let's get out of here then. He said, and they began to run towards the shore. Should we say goodbye to the mayor? Nami asked, passing a bag of gold to Zoro, who caught Luffy's eyes and tossed it into an alley. Nah, no point. Luffy said, and they got to the boats and began to sail out when Nami realized one of her bags was missing. Where did you put that other one? She demanded Zoro, who looked at her funny. Luffy said to drop it. He answered and leaned back on one of the boats. No, he didn't. Don't make things up. She shouted at him and he smiled. Yeah, I did, the town looks like crap, so I thought they might need some extra help fixing it up. He shrugged before remembering his hat had been ripped. Ah, Nami. Fix my hat. He demanded, and her brow twitched as she closed her eyes. I should drown you for that. She growled, and Luffy smiled at her. Please? He asked her, giving her the big eyes he would give Marco when he wanted something, or to Thatch when he wanted extra portions. Fine. She yelled, taking the hat forcefully and pulling out a sewing kit, stitching the hat back together. Hat. He began to chant as Nami worked. What now, Luffy? Zoro asked him, knowing he needed to distract Luffy before Nami actually did drown the man. We go get our next nakama. Luffy said, and Zoro nodded. Which is? He actually didn't know all the people Luffy had planned. Usopp. He said, smiling at the thought of his sniper. Maybe while we're there we can get a ship, these boats aren't going to make it far. Nami said, tossing the hat back to Luffy, who caught it with joy. Right. Luffy said, smiling. They were almost there, his small family was almost complete. Usopp was sitting on the cliff, a telescope in his hands and a smile on his face. It's about time you got here, Luffy. Meanwhile, back on the Moby Dick. What's wrong, Marco? Pops asked his son, who had been pacing the ship for a few hours now. Someone's fighting with Luffy, Yoi. he said simply and Thatch laughed from the railing. Mother knows best. He chirped earning a glare from Marco. It feels different, maybe we should call him Yoi. Marco said to himself and Pops laughed. You worry too much Marco. And maybe Marco did, but even from a distance his bond with Luffy was one of the strongest any had seen. He's going to get into battles Marco, we can't be there to stop each and every one of them. Thatch said smiling at his brother. I know that but something feels weird Yoi, he said looking up at Pops who nodded because even he had felt the change happen in the world. The seas are changing, a new generation has taken to its waters. Pops said, and even though he was happy to have Luffy out following his dreams, he wasn't looking forward to the new rookies coming his way. He hasn't got a bounty yet, so he can't be doing something that dangerous. Thatch sighed and Marco shook his head. It's only a matter of time, I can feel it Yoi. And he knew he was right, Luffy wasn't one to stay silent no matter where he was in the world. I hope his is bigger than Ace's was. Thatch laughed. He'd have to pull off something huge for that to happen Yoi. Marco sighed and Pops laughed. He always did want to outdo his brothers. Pop said softly and Marco smiled relaxing some. I just hope he stays safe, is that too much to ask Yoi? Pops and Thatch laughed. For Luffy? Probably. Marco shook his head wondering just what his little Luffy was doing to make him worry this far away. He'll go grey acting like that. Thatch said throwing an arm around Marco's shoulders and leading him away. Let's grab a drink while we can. He shouted and Marco smiled, a drink sounded nice. Only if I make my own, I don't trust you Yoi. Marco said causing Thatch to give his best friend a shocked expression. You insult me brother. He said but the smile that played on the man's lips spoke otherwise. I think I'd like my teeth to remain white this time Yoi. He said to the prankster as they walked away together towards the galley leaving Pops to look out over the water. What changes are you causing in this world, Luffy? He asked, but the wind didn't tell him anything, he will just have to keep his eyes open and ears sharp for anything now. The world was changing, but was it such a bad thing? He'd have to wait and see for himself. Nami was laughing, and that was something she hadn't done in a really long time, or at least honestly. We're going to meet up with my friend Usopp. Luffy said. Zoro nodded, accepting that was going to happen, and chose to rest his eyes. If you hadn't found me, how were you expecting to find him? Nami asked, Luffy leaning on his hand to look at her, he closed his eyes and tried to think about it. I dunno, maybe just by luck I guess. He said then shrugged his shoulders causing her to sigh and smile at the boy. Luck doesn't work that way Luffy. She said and he shook his head. Of course it does. Luck brought me to all of my friends you included. He said and she laughed at his logic. Whatever you say Luffy. But she smiled at him as they continued to follow the compass to the right island. Luffy looked at her and could clearly see that even though she was here with them she wasn't truly here. Oi Nami. Luffy called to her sitting up and giving her one of his very serious looks. What? I don't have any more food for you. She said thinking that look was for food. If you're ever in any trouble, I promise I will help you. He said and Nami felt the color pale in her skin, what did he know? I'm fine. She said and Luffy just nodded not wanting to press right now. Just remember that if you ever need help all you gotta do is ask. He said leaning back putting his hands behind his head and closing his eyes. Nami felt tears brim in her eyes but wiped them away quickly, she hadn't cried in years and wouldn't break that right now. What stunned Nami was that even though this boy was a pirate he seemed so genuine. Luffy didn't have any hidden agendas or plans for anything as far as she could tell and what he had done for that dog stuck with her. She knew she could be wrong but there was a good chance this pirate wasn't so bad. Get some sleep idiot, we'll be there soon. She said to him and looked up at the bright sky, there were no clouds to block the burning sun. Thanks. She whispered hoping he didn't hear her but from under his straw hat, Luffy smiled not saying a word in return. Wake up. Nami yelled at the sleeping boys in the boat she was sailing beside. Is the meat ready Thatch? Luffy asked sleepily and Nami felt a bit of confusion on the name she was just called. No the meat is not ready. We're at the next island. She said and the drowsiness was gone from Luffy's eyes as he punched Zoro in the arm to wake him up. Zoro, we're here. He shouted in excitement and the swordsman opened his eyes and rubbed his shoulder in annoyance. Alright. He said simply looking towards the growing land, a smirk playing on his face. So now we just need to locate that Usopp guy right? Zoro asked him and Luffy nodded. Once they landed on the shore Luffy jumped the small boat and instantly began to look around. Man it's been forever. He smiled and it only grew as a slingshot dart hit him in the foot. Welcome to this island ruled by the greatest sniper you'll ever meet, Usopp-sama. A tall man with a long nose stood tall, his one hand on his hip, the other pointing high in the air, causing him to look proud. What Usopp had yet to gain in height he had gained in muscles. He was stronger than the lanky teenager Luffy had met 2 years ago, but even now he had lots of room for improvement. Usopp. Luffy shouted, and Usopp looked down at the boy in front of him, a small smirk on his tanned face. "What took you so long, Luffy?" he asked, and Luffy laughed loud. "My first mate got lost," Luffy said, and Zoro shouted at him from behind, "and my navigator hasn't completely decided if she wants to join yet or not." Luffy shrugged, and Nami closed her eyes, her brow twitching. "How about you? You're not going to tell me no, are you?" Luffy looked up the cliff at Usopp, giving the man his big brown eyes, and Usopp jumped down the cliff carefully topland in front of Luffy. "I promised you I'd join you, didn't I?" he asked, and Luffy felt relief spread through him, knowing that Usopp wasn't going to cause him any troubles. "Yeah, you did," Luffy said, smiling. Zoro watched the scene and couldn't help but smile because even he could see the bond between them. "Luffy, how's your old man doing?" Usopp asked as they began to make their way to the village. "He should be fine, but Ma's become super protective lately over everyone. Thatch said that since he can't worry about me as much he needs someone else to worry about, apparently it's Pops." Usopp laughed, remembering hearing tales of how protective Luffy's ma could be. "Luffy, he knows?" Zoro asked, and Usopp nodded, turning to look back at Zoro. "Yeah, I know his past," Usopp said, and looked at the two people that were following Luffy. "So he suckered you guys into joining as well?" Usopp said, and Zoro grinned. "I'd say the same to you," he said, and Usopp laughed. "That's Luffy for ya." He chuckled, but Nami remained silent, her eyes overshadowed. Even if Luffy wanted to help her, she knew he couldn't do anything until she asked for it. They got to a restaurant and Usopp helped them order a lot of food to keep Luffy satisfied. "I take it your appetite has grown as well in these past 2 years," Usopp said, and Luffy nodded, drool beginning to form at the corner of his mouth. "Eat as much as you like," he cheered, and Luffy had sparkles replace his eyes. "You sure about that?" Zoro asked him, and Usopp nodded, the excitement of having his friend here fogging his brain. Once Luffy had eaten his fill and Zoro had a few good drinks, Nami looked over to Usopp. "We're going to need a new ship if we plan to go any further. Is there any way you can help us?" Nami asked Usopp, who looked down at the table in thought. "I'm not too sure I can help with the ship part," but he trailed off, and Luffy looked at his friend in concern. "Luffy, I might need your help with something," Usopp said, looking up at Luffy now, a note of seriousness in his eyes. "What can we do to help?" Luffy asked him, and Usopp relaxed a bit and looked out the window towards a house sitting on top of a hill. "On the other end of this village a good friend of mine is sick," Usopp started, and Luffy frowned. "I'm not a good doctor, have you tried feeding her some meat?" Luffy asked, only to get a scowl from Nami. "It's not a sickness I need help with, Luffy, listen to me, please," he asked, and Luffy nodded while taking a bite of more food. "I've been training hard for the past 2 years, knowing I'd have to somehow match up to you in strength if I want to ever stand with you as a pirate," Usopp began, but Luffy opened his mouth to interrupt, but Usopp held his hand up, telling Luffy to let him finish. "During my training I found I could see things better, hear things better, and I'm honestly not sure when it began, but when I'm with Kaya, I try and make her feel better through my stories," Usopp said, and Luffy smiled, knowing that Usopp's observation haki was awakening. "She has a butler and something doesn't feel right with him. Whenever he yells at me I almost feel something like something's a little off about him," Usopp said, and Luffy knew that observation haki could help you get a good feel of a person and their intentions. If what Usopp was saying is true, then something might be bad about that butler guy. "So what do you want me to do about it?" Luffy asked him, and Zoro looked up at the sniper. "Do you want us to kick his ass?" Zoro asked him curiously, causing Nami to just open her mouth and stare at the two boys. "You can't just fight anyone you want, even if he has a bad feeling about this butler guy. It's wrong," she yelled at them, and Usopp nodded. "You're kinda right, I don't want you guys to go and fight him so easily, we need to make a plan and work this out." "Hey, but can't we just go beat him up if he's a bad guy?" Luffy whined. "No, we can't," Usopp shouted at Luffy, who just pouted at not being able to do anything. "Why don't you like this butler? You can't just go on instinct, he must have done something to you for you to feel like this?" Nami asked Usopp, but the boy shook his head. "It's a feeling, I can't really even explain it, and I just know something's going to happen if we don't do something," Usopp said to them, and Luffy looked up from where he had been pouting to smile at his friend. "Well, let's go meet your girlfriend then," Luffy said simply, and Usopp glared at Luffy. "She's not my girlfriend," he shouted, standing up. "I'm going to go up first, you guys stay here for a while, that way I can let her know others will be coming," he said, and Luffy just shrugged. "Sure, why not, can I have more meat?" he asked Usopp, and the guy shook his head. "You haven't changed a bit, Luffy, sure, why not?" Luffy gave a cheer in happiness as he called over the waitress to order more food as Usopp left. Once the food had been delivered and eaten, Luffy was starting to look the shape of a circle with all he had stuffed into himself. "Really, how can you eat that much?" Nami asked Luffy, but she had a smile on her face as he just laughed. "Stop right there, you guys. 3 small children came running in and Luffy looked at them curiously trying to remember if he knew them or not. "We saw you come in here with our great Captain Usopp, what have you done with him?" One of them yelled at Luffy, who had begun to pat his stomach in content, ignoring the children since they didn't come up in his memory at all. Zoro leaned in and looked at them, an evil grin on his face, and Nami began to laugh behind her hand, and Luffy looked at his friends in interest, wondering what was going on. "If you're looking for your captain, well, we ate him," Zoro said, giving them a scary look, and watched as they paled before turning towards Nami and screaming at her. Luffy couldn't stop himself from laughing along with his friends at the scene, not expecting Zoro of all people to say that. After everyone had calmed down a bit and the kids were feeling normal as could be but still keeping a good distance away from them, Luffy wanted to know more about what was going on. Aya's parents died not that long ago and Usopp has been keeping her company as best as he can. One said, and Luffy nodded but probably didn't really catch anything. "Our captain should be up there right now, in fact." Another said, and Nami nodded. "Yeah, he told us he was heading there," she said, and they smiled at her. "Then why don't we go up there as well?" They all shouted, and Luffy smiled at them, glad to have some action finally happening. They followed the boys up to the large mansion house that apparently Usopp was visiting. "Should we go knock on the door?" Nami asked, looking around the hedge, but the boys shook their heads, indicating that was a bad idea. "The butler isn't very welcoming of people, so Usopp has to sneak in to see Ms. Kaya," one kid said, and began to mess around with the hedge and pulled out a square-shaped block of tree, letting them go through. "Wow, this is more adventurous than I thought," Luffy said, excitement building in him. "Oi, Usopp," Luffy called to his friend who was sitting on a tree branch talking to a pretty lady. "Oh, Luffy." Usopp looked down at Luffy and the people following behind him. Kaya was shocked to see people she had never met before in her yard but welcomed them either way. "Who are you guys?" Kaya asked softly. She was pale, but other than that she looked to be fine. "That's Luffy, he's in my crew, I was just about to tell you about him," Usopp said proudly to Kaya, but Luffy crossed his arms and shook his head. "It's the other way around, Usopp, you're in my crew," Luffy said, and Usopp rubbed the back of his head sheepishly and Kaya giggled. "Hey miss, I was wondering if I could ask you a favor," Luffy called up to her, and Usopp tilted his head in confusion at Luffy. "From me?" She had never met these people before, so she had to admit she was curious. "Yeah, you see, we're in need of a proper ship, our little boats aren't going to make it far and I really don't want to ask my pops for help already," Luffy said, and Kaya was about to open her mouth to respond but was cut off by a tall man with glasses. "You there, what are you doing on this property?" he asked them, and Luffy had to fight off a smirk. So this was the guy that Usopp didn't like, now he could understand why. This guy just radiated bad intentions, which caused Luffy to feel the urge to just kick his ass already. "Get out, all of you, I'll have you know this is private property, meaning I can charge you for stepping foot on here," he said and fixed his glasses in a weird way, and then Kaya called his name worriedly. "Unless you have business with me, I want you all out of here now." Luffy could sense this man was not who he said he was, but his love for pissing people off was too strong for him to fight. "Alright, can you give us a ship then?" Luffy asked him, and Usopp, who had gone into hiding behind the tree, froze, wondering what Luffy was doing. "Of course not," he said in anger, and Luffy caught the glint on his eyes. Was that fear? The butler turned away from Luffy and looked towards the tree where Usopp was hiding, then called him out. "So you are here, Usopp, I've heard quite the stories about you and your reputation in the village," the butler said to him. Usopp then jumped out from behind the tree to stand beside Luffy. "Hi," Usopp said awkwardly as the butler turned his eyes onto him. "You've been on quite the adventure, that's really impressive for someone as young as yourself," he said cockily, and Luffy tilted his head. "I've been on more adventures than he has probably," Luffy said, thinking of the things that had happened when he was just a kid. "I wasn't talking to you," he said to Luffy, causing the boy captain to cross his arms and stare at him. "No, you're talking to one of my nakama, so it doesn't really make any difference," Luffy said with a bit of heat in his voice. "Nakama? Do you also follow the, what was it, great Captain Usopp?" he said, and Luffy didn't say anything else since there really wasn't any other reason to. Luffy felt no need to explain himself to this guy, so he did what he does best in these situations, nothing. "Usopp, you'll never be anything more than the son of a filthy pirate," he shouted at Usopp, and Luffy's eyes darkened slightly as the image of his own father came into mind. He could see Pops on his chair, hear his laughter, and see his smile. "And what's the problem with that? Usopp's father is 1,000 times the man you will ever be." Luffy growled, his hat overshadowing his eyes. "I would expect nothing less from followers of this scum. You and your kind should leave this respectful young lady alone. What is it you're truly after, money? How much do you want?" He mocked them, and Usopp was shaking right beside Luffy in anger. Aya began to yell at her butler to apologize to Usopp and his friends, but he refused. Yusuf was trying to calm her down, while the others just stood by and watched. Zoro wouldn't move unless Luffy gave him permission to, and Nami, as much as she wanted to, didn't know what she could do in this situation. "I'm just stating the truth, milady, and I do sympathize with you. You must hate your idiot of a father for choosing to take to the seas and become nothing more than pirate scum," he said to Yusuf, who in turn looked at Luffy, who had let the anger fall from his face, but Zoro could feel it in the air. For Yusuf and Zoro, who knew of Luffy's heritage, they knew this man wasn't just insulting Yusuf but Luffy as well. Luffy, on the other hand, was thinking of Ace and how much he hated his own birth father. Was it people like this that had twisted Ace's ideas on his father into ones of pain? If so, Luffy was going to need to start making a list of reasons to kick this guy's ass. "Don't you dare say anything about my dad," Yusuf finally shouted, and Kaya turned her attention onto Yusuf and his shout. "Why not? Isn't it times like these you should do what you do best and lie? Why not tell me your dad is actually a merchant sailor or even a marine, not some worthless pirate scum in search of treasure?" The butler continued on, and surprisingly enough, it wasn't Yusuf that acted, it was Luffy. Luffy's fist flew straight for the butler's face. "You talk shit, but honestly you know nothing. Yusuf's father is a good man and I won't let trash like you put him down." Luffy's eyes were dark, and while he wanted to punch the butler over and over again, he didn't because Yusuf planted his hand on his shoulder to hold him back. "Ace and point, only people who can follow a man such as Yusuf would act in such a violent way," the butler said from the ground, glaring up at Luffy, who tried to take a step further, finding Yusuf's grip stronger than he expected. "Let me hit him again?" Luffy asked Yusuf, who shook his head and looked at the butler instead. "I am proud of my old man and what he has decided to become. I know I may exaggerate from time to time, but I will never lie about the father I am proud of." Yusuf yelled at him, and Kaya put her hand over her mouth in shock at all that was happening. "You may not have been the one to act violently, but that little outburst was proof of your savage blood. I've heard you call pirates great warriors of the sea, but isn't that a foolish way of looking at things? You're just like your father, isn't this why you are getting close to the lady of this house? You want to steal her fortune, don't you?" he said to Yusuf, who then started to say something in return only for the butler to insult him further. Finally having enough, Yusuf let go of Luffy and grabbed the butler by the collar of his shirt, his fist aimed back ready to punch him. "Stop, Yusuf, please," Kaya shouted from her window down at Yusuf, who flinched at her tone. "No more fighting, I can't take it. Clahitter is a good man, he's just trying to do what he believes is best for me, and well, sometimes he takes it too far." She yelled down to Yusuf and Luffy, who looked up at her with a blank expression on their faces, but Zoro could read Luffy like a book and knew he was annoyed with her nativity. "Leave and never return," he said to Yusuf once the boy had let him go. "Sure, whatever," Yusuf said and walked off the property, annoyed and angry. Yusuf's friends began to shout at the butler, which caused Luffy to join in on the anger. "It's not our place, Luffy," Zoro said to his captain, and even though he too wanted to slice the man up, it was Yusuf's battle to fight, not theirs. "All of you leave this place." And while the kids went running to Nami, Zoro had to drag Luffy away, literally kicking and screaming, which was a pain in the butt for the swordsman. Once they had gotten away from the property and Zoro had decided Luffy was calm enough now to be let go, Luffy found a way to escape from his friends. Following a trail and using his observation haki, he tracked Yusuf down to a cliffside easily. Yusuf was sitting down on the ledge, kicking his feet back and forth with the passing wind and waves. "Hey," Luffy said, taking a seat beside him, catching his attention. "Is it weird to say I knew you were coming?" Yusuf asked Luffy, and Luffy smiled, looking at the boy. "Nope, that means you're getting stronger," he said to Yusuf, who smiled, grateful for the compliment from Luffy. "I'm sorry about all that," Yusuf said, and Luffy shrugged. "I've met your dad, you have more reason to be proud of him than many," he said to Yusuf. He then turned his head towards the sky. "I wish I knew more about him," he whispered. Luffy then smiled his toothy grin. "Then we should set sail soon, otherwise you'll never meet him," Luffy said simply, but Yusuf shook his head. "I can't leave things like this, something still feels wrong," he said, then looked down at the shore where the butler was walking along it with some stranger. "What's he doing there?" Luffy asked, looking down as well, his anger towards that guy returning full blast. "I knew something didn't feel right," Yusuf whispered, looking down at them as well. Luffy turned his eyes towards Yusuf and smirked, hoping to give the sniper a chance to learn. "My brother Aizu is an amazing sniper and he taught me that our eyes can be deceiving and miss things easily," Luffy began, but Yusuf was barely listening as he was trying to see what the butler and the other guy were talking about. "Yusuf," Luffy said, catching his attention finally. "Try observing with your ears and less with your eyes, let your senses do most of the work," he said, and Yusuf made a confused face, but Luffy pointed to the beach, telling him to try it. "That other guy with him is strange," Luffy said, observing them. "I've never seen that guy around the village before," Yusuf said in thought. They listened carefully to what was being said, and the one main thing that stuck out was the plan to murder the rich girl. Kaya. Yusuf whispered in fear. It's critical in our plans that Miss Kaya perishes in an unfortunate accident, so don't screw that up. The butler guy said, and Yusuf narrowed his eyes while Luffy frowned. The other guy began to tell his plan loud and clear, making Yusuf's blood boil at the thought something like this could happen. You felt something was wrong with him. How long have you felt that, Yusuf? Luffy asked his friend. They were now lying on the ground listening. For just under 2 years now, ever since I started training. He whispered back, but his attention was focused onto the butler and his companion. The companion and the butler talked for a while longer. Luffy didn't like what was being said, but then again he didn't understand much of it either way. Yusuf was growling and shaking with anger at this, but he froze when he heard the real name of the butler. Captain Kuro. He whispered, and Luffy just looked at him, clapping his feet together, relaxing on the ledge. Those guys don't sound very nice. Luffy said simply, and Yusuf turned to Luffy with an incredulous look. Luffy, those guys aren't just bad, they're evil. Don't you know who Captain Kuro is? He asked Luffy, who shook his head. I don't really know East Blue Pirates, since they were never a threat to Pops or the family. Luffy shrugged, which was once again a reminder just where Luffy had come from. He was known as the man with 1,000 plans. He's downright scary and evil. Yusuf said, his knees shaking a bit. So he'll be stronger than that boggy guy? Luffy asked, trying to remember the clown guy's name now. Of course. Yusuf shouted at Luffy, not knowing what the heck Luffy was talking about. But still, I've faced stronger pirates than these guys. Luffy whined, and Yusuf shook his head as Luffy stood up suddenly and began to shout at the butler and his companion, gaining their attention. Well, if it isn't Yusuf the mischievous town liar, did you hear anything? The butler asked, and Yusuf, even though he was a lot stronger, was still quite the coward. Nope, nothing. Nothing at all. He shouted, shaking all over and grabbing onto Luffy, who didn't even flinch at the glare he was given. We heard everything. Luffy said simply to the man, who narrowed his eyes, then nodded to his companion, who sighed and stepped forward. Look here, boys, and watch my ring closely. The guy said, and Luffy felt excited all of a sudden. Was this like a trick that's used to try and do to Marco to get him to stop being so cranky? Luffy, don't you see that it's some kind of weapon? I know you're strong, but let's get out of here. Yusuf said from behind Luffy. Luffy's eyes followed the ring as he was directed to, while the guy was saying funny things he didn't really care much about. Yusuf freaking dived away from Luffy, knowing that Luffy was the stronger of the two and could probably take whatever it was on his own. Luffy? Yusuf asked, looking up at his friend, who hadn't moved a muscle. What are you doing? You'll fall like that. Yusuf shouted as Luffy began to sway with the wind and fall from the cliff, landing head first into the ground. This can't be real, Luffy, these people, they just killed Luffy. Yusuf whispered, his eyes wide in fear. Damn it, he whispered as Kuro told his plan to Yusuf, mocking him at the same time. I'm sorry, Luffy. He whispered before getting to his feet and running away. We begin tomorrow. Kuro's words were the last Luffy heard from the bottom of the cliff before sleep truly took over him. Yusuf was running away from the cliff where Luffy had just fallen from. He had seen his best friend hit the sand and not move at all. Luffy was strong, so for something to stop him like that, it must be more powerful than he first thought. Okay, you need to calm down. Yusuf said to himself. He then stopped himself and tried to calm his rapidly beating heart. This is Luffy we're talking about. He's stronger than that. Oh, but he didn't move an inch. I really don't want to be the one to tell his family that Luffy got killed from falling off a cliff. WhiteBeard sounds scary as it is, but from what I've heard of his ma, I'm screwed. Yusuf ranted to himself, a dark cloud falling over his head at the very idea of having to tell anyone about Luffy dying. Hey, Yusuf. Nami called to him, waving her hand at him, calling him over, even if he didn't really want to go. Where's Luffy? Zoro asked him, his arms crossed over his chest, looking at Yusuf expectantly. He is ugh. Yusuf said, and Zoro raised a brow, his steel gaze sharp on the boy. He's at the cliffside relaxing, haha. You know what's he's like, so easygoing and all. But I'm in a real hurry, I've got people to see, places to go, you know what I mean. Well, I'll see you guys around. Yusuf said rather hurriedly before taking off away from the small pirate crew. What was that all about? Nami asked, not sure why Yusuf was so freaked out. Luffy is strong, I wouldn't call him my captain if he wasn't, but Zoro said, only for Nami to smile at him and shake her head. Then have faith in him, right? She said to Zoro, catching him off guard, so all he did was nod in response. Zoro decided to go and see Luffy for himself, since that was the only way to completely clear his head. Where are you going? Nami asked him as he began to walk away. For a walk. He said simply and continued on the path that leads towards the shore. Nami just shrugged her shoulder, not worrying too much, until Zoro suddenly took a sharp left straight into a forest, completely leaving the path. The walk right, she said, sweat dropping at his directional skills and wondering just where exactly he thought he was going. Nami decided she would head back to the village since there wasn't any real point sitting around a farmer's field and she might be able to get a better idea on what was happening with Usopp. Usopp was running towards the village with a few thoughts in his mind. Should he warn the villagers? Should he force them out of their homes and could he get everyone away from the village in time? But what of Kaya? What should he do about her? If he warned her, would she believe him? He didn't think so since most of the village, if not all of it, knew he was a liar. Usopp began to slow down and walk now, sweat was on his forehead from all of his nerves being shaken. "Hey Usopp, what's wrong?" One of the kids that he called his friends asked him, walking up to their slightly pale captain. He started, then began to think again, would they believe him if he told them the truth? It was a shot in the dark, but just maybe. "We need to warn the village. Pirates will be attacking soon." He shouted at them and their eyes widened before one of them shook their head and sighed. "But we already did that this morning, Captain," one said, and Usopp just stared at the boy. "Yeah, we can't do it too many times or we'll become a bother to the village," another said, and Usopp closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "I'm telling the truth this time," he shouted, and they just stared at him. "Forget it, damn it," he said, turning away from them and running away. Usopp knew that if his own friends didn't believe him, then the village wouldn't. The only person he could count on for help now was Luffy, and as far as he knew, Luffy might be dead. Looks like he needed to go back to that beach and find out the truth or his village and his friends were screwed. First though, he was going to stop by to try and warn Kaya. She'd listen to him, right? Zoro was getting frustrated with all of these trees. He was more than sure he was walking towards the beach, so where did this forest come from? Damn it. If I keep running this way, I'm sure I'll find the exit, he said to himself and began to run, only for him to find himself back in the center of the forest. How the hell did I end up back here? Is there some kind of trick to this place? Zoro asked, running forward once again, only to return back to the center from the opposite direction. "I just want to get to the beach, forget it, I've had enough," Zoro said, standing up tall and closing his eyes, taking in his surroundings before unsheathing his blade. "If I can't run to find the exit, I'll just make my own," he said, and began to cut down every tree that crossed his path until he had finally exited the now patchy forest. "Seriously, places like that should be guarded," he said, glaring at the trees that were left standing after his rampage. Sighing and putting his blade completely back in its sheath, Zoro began to look around him, happy to see the beach not that far away. He walked towards a ledge so he could see better and hopefully find his captain. Jumping down the ledge, his boots hit the sand, sinking slightly before he continued along the shore before his eyes found Luffy on the ground, not moving. "Boy, Luffy," Zoro yelled, moving towards his captain, worry gripping his chest, but he felt himself relax when he finally got to Luffy and found him only sleeping on the sand. "Easy going," Zoro muttered, remembering Usopp's words before he began to shake Luffy awake. "Come on, you idiot, there's no time for naps right now," Zoro scolded as Luffy began to sit up and rubbed his eyes sleepily. "That was a nice nap," Luffy yawned, and Zoro did feel a slight bit of envy. While he was chopping down a forest, his captain was taking a nap. "What are you doing down here anyways?" Zoro asked him, and Luffy looked around him, realizing he wasn't on the cliff anymore. I must have fallen," he said simply, and Zoro shook his head, sighing. "Usopp's acting funny, and I'm guessing you might have an idea as to why?" he asked, looking at Luffy, who smiled at his friend. "Something like that. I heard something fun, wanna hear about it?" he asked Zoro, who smirked back at him, knowing that what Luffy considers being fun usually meant a fight of some sorts. "Why not?" he asked, taking a seat as Luffy began to tell Zoro what he had heard. Nami was walking through the village and listening to what people had been saying. Usopp was considered a liar here, and for good reasons as well, apparently. "Hey, why does Usopp lie so much?" she asked a lady who was sweeping her porch. "No one really knows anymore, he's just been doing it for so long, now it's become a habit of sorts," she said, and continued to sweep as Nami bowed and continued on. "The boy who cried wolf," Nami mumbled under her breath, remembering an old tale she had once read with her sister. "I hope nothing bad happens." She decided to go find Zoro and Luffy, knowing them they had probably figured something out, but then again knowing them. Nami sighed, hoping they both weren't getting into too much trouble already. Usopp had gone to try and warn Kaya, but that had no effect at all. In fact, it had gone worse for him than he ever thought it would. Couldn't she see that he was trying to protect her? Couldn't she see that he was her friend trying to? It frustrated him to no end that all he wanted to do was protect the people he cared about and the village that had practically raised him, but no one seemed to want to listen to him. "Oi!" Nami called from the cliff above, looking down at Zoro and Luffy, who were having a conversation. She ran to a smaller slope where she could come down without hurting herself to find out what they were doing just sitting there. "Nami, where were you?" Luffy asked her, and she just closed her eyes. "I was checking out the village, trying to find out why Usopp was so freaked out earlier," she said to them, and Luffy nodded in understanding. "I know why, and now so does Zoro." Luffy said, and she just stared at him before rubbing her forehead softly. Please explain to me then. She asked, and Luffy laughed his special laugh as he and Zoro told her what they knew. I'm really glad you heard all of that, Luffy. She said, smiling, and Luffy tilted his head in confusion. Now we know when to get the heck out of here so we don't get involved. She said, but Luffy shook his head. Usopp is my sniper, I'm not going anywhere without him. He said, and Zoro knew that to be the truth. When Luffy wanted something he could be as stubborn as ever until he got it, especially if it was a new nakama. They were sitting down in the sand, Luffy beginning his normal whine for meat, while the others tried to hide their smiles of fondness for the boy captain. Usopp, having had a bad argument with Kaya while trying to save her life, decided that if nothing else worked, he'd go check on Luffy. Usopp. Luffy called to the boy who was looking down to the ground, feeling rather pathetic at this point, which caught Luffy's attention quick. Usopp, realizing someone had called his name, looked up and saw Luffy sitting there perfectly fine with Zoro and Nami beside him. Luffy. He said, tears on the edges of his eyes at the fact his best friend was alive and well. Luffy. I thought I was going to have to tell your family you were dead. Usopp yelled at him, and Luffy chuckled before looking at him funny. I was just taking a nap, haven't had one in a while, you know. He said, and Nami scowled, knowing full well that he and Zoro took naps quite a lot on the way to this island. What happened to your face? Nami asked Usopp, a tint of worry in her voice, seeing the normally tanned boy's face with a bit of sharp red on the cheek. I had an argument with Kaya, Usopp said, putting his hand on his cheek where it stung. You tried to warn her? Zoro asked him, and Usopp nodded before looking at Zoro in surprise. How the hell did you know? He asked, and Zoro just pointed at Luffy, who laughed. I told them what I know. He admitted, and Usopp sighed. I guess you would, they're your crew after all. Usopp sighed, and Luffy nodded before looking at Usopp with sharp eyes. You're also in my crew, remember? He asked him, reminding the sniper that he was one of Luffy's nakama. Usopp looked up at Luffy and nodded his head, wiping his nose on his sleeve and drying his eyes. Right. So what are we going to do about this? Zoro asked, looking at Luffy, who then turned to look at Usopp. What do you want us to do? He asked a boy who thought about his options for a moment before looking Luffy straight in the eyes seriously. I want you to help me protect my village and Kaya. He said, and Luffy grinned. Then I guess I'll have to do that. Luffy then stood up and dusted off his pants, looking at his two other nakama. You guys in? He asked, and Zoro closed his eyes, giving a deep sigh before smirking at Luffy. Did I ever have a choice? He asked, but Luffy knew he was excited to battle again. Fine, I'm in as well, but I get all of the treasure you find. Nami said, pointing her finger up in the air, making it clear what she wanted, and Luffy laughed. Right then, it's settled. Luffy cheered, and even though Usopp knew Luffy considered him on his crew, he couldn't stop the feeling of shock from taking over him. You're really going to help me? Usopp asked, and Luffy nodded while Zoro and Nami smiled at the boy. You're our nakama and we never turn our backs on a friend. Luffy said to him kindly, and Usopp felt another round of tears starting up. Alright, we need to come up with a plan. Usopp said, blinking fast to stop the tears since now was not the time for them. Man, I've spent some time fighting New World pirates, so these guys should be a piece of cake, maybe a piece of meat sounds better. Luffy started to drift off into the land of meat as Nami pulled him back. Let's think of a plan, then we'll go grab food, alright? She asked him, and Luffy nodded, now focusing since meat was promised if he did. Why don't we think of a plan while getting food? We've been sitting here all day and the sun's going down soon. Zoro said, looking at the sky and knowing that as hard as Luffy may want to try, he wasn't going to concentrate on an empty stomach. Best idea ever. Luffy cheered, jumping up, and the group just smiled at him, knowing there wasn't changing his mind now. Alright, let's go. Usopp said and smiled, but the feelings of worry were only intensifying by the minute, knowing that by morning the pirates would be here and bad things could happen. Captain. 3 kids came running towards Usopp as they walked down the trail, asking what the problem was. They explained how they had gone to see Kaya and she told them something weird. Usopp knew that the kids were strong, but they weren't strong for this. I was just telling another lie, nothing's going to happen, I was silly, haha, sorry about that guys. He said, rubbing the back of his head while the 3 behind him were no longer smiling, but watching Usopp carefully. The kids of course didn't take it well and chose to tell Usopp in their own way how they felt before leaving him alone with Luffy and the others. Why did you lie to them? Luffy asked, his hunger momentarily forgotten. Because I know there is nothing they can do to help. Usopp replied, and Luffy shook his head. But what you said was the truth, if nothing is done this place will be totaled, Nami said, and Usopp turned to look at her. Zoro just stood tall, his arms crossed over his chest. I tried to warn Kaya and she didn't believe me, if I try and warn the village they won't believe me. There's nothing I can do because no one believes a liar. Usopp told them, and Luffy frowned even more at him. I believe you. Now let's go eat, all this talking is hurting my stomach. He said, and they fell back into heading towards the restaurant. Yusuf didn't say anything, but he was honestly happy when Luffy said he believed him. So what are we going to do about this, Luffy? We can't just leave this town alone now. Nami said, and Luffy nodded while biting off another chunk of meat. I'm strong, but you guys need some training. Luffy swallowed his meat and the group looked at him now confused. I was trained a lot by my family and I've also been fighting pirates since I was like, well, I dunno, 10 years old. But you guys haven't, so maybe instead of thinking of this as a problem, try and see it as an opportunity to get better. Luffy said and smiled widely at them as they just blinked. Not all of us are strong monsters like you. Nami said, ready to punch Luffy over the head as he laughed. A chance to get stronger, Zoro said to himself and really felt excited at the idea. Zoro knew that as of right now Luffy was still much stronger than he was, and if this opportunity gave him the chance to gain some strength, then maybe he should use it. So what are you guys good at? Usopp asked them, hoping to know what they could do to help fight. I'm good at cutting things. Zoro said, placing his hand on his swords. I can stretch. Luffy smiled and Nami made a sign of money. I'm good at finding treasure. She said and Usopp nodded. I'm good at running away. He admitted, hoping to pass the fighting on to them. You're also a good sniper and you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. Luffy said, and Usopp gave a small smile in gratitude to Luffy. Then let me prove it. Tonight I'll set up some traps to trick the crew and even slow them down. Usopp said, knowing that his skills were more set for fighting dirty rather than in their face. Nami, could you go distract Kaya, maybe try and get her away from Kuro? Usopp asked her and Nami nodded, understanding that Kaya was in trouble and right now it might be a good idea for her to be away somewhere safer than her home. I got it, I'll head over there soon and talk with her. Nami smiled at him and Usopp nodded in thanks. Zoro and I will go keep watch. Luffy said, but Usopp shook his head. I agree with Usopp, you guys will probably sleep through your watch. Instead, why not help Usopp set up? She asked them and Zoro just nodded, not wanting to argue with the witch. But I always did watch back home, Luffy pouted and Usopp shook his head. And how many times did you fall asleep on the job? Usopp asked him and Luffy tried to think about it. No, every time I did watch, Ma was with me. Marco would only allow Luffy to do watch as long as he was there to ensure Luffy got enough sleep in the end of it. Marco also didn't mind doing his paperwork while Luffy kept lookout, and when the boy fell asleep he would take over smiling. My point exactly. Usopp said, and the restaurant owner was looking their way as if telling them to finish up so he could close. So we all know what to do, right? Usopp asked, and all nodded as they left. Nami waved goodbye to her friends and walked down the path to check on Kaya. I know that butler isn't going to open the front doors, so it looks like Usopp's spot will have to do. She said, searching the bush for the hole to climb through. Looking up at the tree, Nami jumped up it easily before knocking on the window. Kaya. She called softly, hoping that she didn't cause any trouble. Kaya opened the window in excitement, hoping to be Usopp so they could properly talk, but when she saw it was the girl from before she felt confused. My name's Nami. Nami introduced herself and Kaya took the outstretched hand in greeting. What are you doing here, Nami? Kaya asked and Nami smiled kindly at her. I heard you and Usopp had a little argument. I was thinking us girls could have a little girl time together. Nami asked, hoping that would work. Kaya wasn't too sure what she should be doing or really what to say to Nami, who was already pushing her way into Kaya's room. It'll be a sleepover. Nami said with a wink. Kaya had never had one of those before, so she had to admit she was very interested in the idea. Alright, but we have to be quiet. She said and Nami smiled. Of course. Usopp, Luffy and Zoro were helping to put traps around the shores they could come from. What if they don't come from this spot but from the other area? Luffy asked, which surprised Usopp that Luffy was thinking this all through. Then I'll go and make sure it's covered as well, we can't take any chances this time. Usopp said and Luffy nodded before motioning for Usopp to come talk with him. Usopp, don't be scared. Luffy said to him, knowing full well that Usopp was terrified of fighting these pirates. I'm not scared. I'm the brave Captain Usopp. He shouted, but his knees were beginning to shake. Do you know what the best thing about being a sniper is? Luffy asked him, Aizu in his mind at that moment. Being able to hit your target, right? Usopp asked and Luffy buzzed at him saying nope. It's being able to watch our backs. A sniper doesn't have to fight on the front lines because he's making sure our backs are covered. Pops may have scars on his chest, but his back is forever untouched because he has reliable snipers just like my big brother Aizu, watching Pop's back. Luffy told him and Usopp stared at Luffy, but a warm feeling of pride was filling his chest. I'll protect you guys just the same. Usopp declared and Luffy smiled at him. I'll be counting on you. He said before walking back to the slope where Zoro had just poured some oil to make it slippery. We're all set now, we just need to wait. Usopp said, looking at the work they had done. I can't wait. Luffy smiled widely before sitting down on the dirt road looking off into the night. I take it you're not going to fight as much in this, are you? Zoro asked Luffy, who gave his special little laugh. I will maybe, I like fighting, but Ace said I should give you guys a chance to get stronger. Luffy said to Zoro, who shook his head. I've been training ever since I met you, I'm pretty sure I'm strong enough to face whatever is on the Grand Line, and Usopp must have been doing the same if he knows your background. Zoro said, and Luffy gave a small smile this time. Sure, you guys are a lot stronger than before, but this will be a good chance to see just how strong. That Kuro guy is mine to fight though, so leave him to me. Luffy said, causing Zoro to raise a brow. I thought you'd leave him to Usopp since this was his problem. Zoro asked, and Luffy thought about it for a moment. I let Usopp have the first shot at the guy, but he's mine. Luffy said confidently. Why are you so determined to fight him? Luffy have Zoro a serious look in return. Because, no one mocks the bonds of family and Nakama around me and gets away with it. Luffy said, and Zoro grinned at him. He really hoped he got the chance to see a good fight from his captain, not many in the East Blue after all can't say the follow a man who lived under Whitebeard's flag. I'll show you how much stronger I've become, Luffy. Zoro said before sitting down under a tree and closing his eyes, trying to catch a few moments of rest before the fight. I really can't wait now. That is the end, so thanks for watching. Comment down below with recommendations on what fanfic I should do next. And remember to like and subscribe to my channel.